Hey guys, Scott Martin here with Jay Cardwell, and we're here with another one of the series of Being Here Now. This particular episode is about the mechanism of belief, and we gave Jay kind of some different options of things, and this is the one that kind of lit us up today. When we want to talk about the mechanism of belief, we're basically saying that if you believe something, that there's a mechanism that serves you in a particular way. It can also not serve you, but there's an activity that's kind of occurring. I think that one of the most obvious ways for a lot of people of faith is, if you have a belief in your particular religion. For example, people that believe that Jesus is their Lord and Savior. That may be one particular example. And we're not here for a religious discussion as much as we are to understand these metaphoric ways that we get energy in our life. And what we're suggesting is that there is a mechanism in belief that allows you to activate the placebo effect within any system, and to utilize your consciousness as a way to receive energy. So we want to come at this from a couple different angles. One, when we look at Donnie Epstein's work, Donnie Epstein's work, where he shows these different categories of how people get energy in their life. We've got bio from the body, emotional, lower mental, upper mental, soul, spirit, and these are all metaphors for different areas of our life, of the story of how we kind of relate to reality and how we relate to the question of the abyss of forever, and we come up with these answers. And we can look at psychological studies pretty much across the board, and we can see how we look at mortality as an example have, really, really, large effects, and everything from self-esteem to, you name it. There's a lot of ways that our belief system affects the way that we're comfortable in our life.
Yeah, definitely see that.
So, when we're looking at, soul, spirit, that large spirit one, when I'm talking to clients, a lot of times I'm asking them what their language of spirituality is, because it doesn't really matter what my language of spirituality is. It matters what they believe, because what they believe is what's going to open pathways, doors, for them, and how they receive. And there's dangerous ways for us to use belief also. There's a topic, or there's an activity, a mechanism known as a spiritual bypass, where instead of us getting energy from like bio, body, exercise, food, emotion, working with our emotions, working with thought, cognitive behavioral therapy, lower mental, upper mental, where we're asking, hey, is there a better way? And soul, kind of where we're using a metaphor for what's our authentic self? What is it that we really, really want in this world? And then spirit being this concept that there is something greater than ourselves, whether it's God, whether it's, a universe that we are a part of this one. There's a lot of different ways that people believe, or just the science of energy, that everything is energy and that we are a part of that energy as well. And so moving into the science of that understanding, we're saying that if you can open your belief system that energy follows consciousness and matter is entrained by energy, that it will open up energy for you in your life. And we want to define energy with its parallel of information. Information and energy really are the same thing. So when people are suffering, when people are struggling, they're stuck in their life, the concept of suffering is that I'm in a state of being where I can't escape it because I don't have enough information to escape it. Because if I had the information, I'd be out of there, right? I would have a flow to my life if I knew how. So I don't have enough information, hence I don't have enough energy. So our goal when we talk about the mechanism of belief is we want to believe in something. Now, there's a lot of people out there that believe in their religion a certain way that they're going to say, well, this is the only way that you can believe. Well, I'm not here to take away somebody's belief. In fact, there's many, gurus and spiritual leaders that say that to try to take away somebody's, belief in God, their connection to God is almost a soul sin as well. Like I'm not Catholic. You know, I went to private Catholic school from 4th grade to 8th grade. I have certain issues with Catholicism. Now, people that may be Catholic can, you know, they can take that with a grain of salt one way or the other. It's just that I've also been exposed to other belief systems where I absolutely felt the presence of God in a lot of different belief systems as well. So that's my personal, perspective. That's my personal experience. So it's going to be very difficult for somebody to convince me that there's only one way to God. In fact, I look at it kind of like a mathematical equation that if you say there's only one way to God, then by mathematics alone, you've just eliminated all these other ways that God can come to you. Now, whether that encourages people out there to seek outside of their own understanding, if what you have is working for you, like just because I don't resonate with Catholicism, you're also not going to convince me that however million Spanish mothers in South America that are praying on the rosary, you're not going to convince me that it doesn't have power. Like it absolutely does. There's energy that's being kind of created in that situation.
I wish there was a way to have a metric when people just turn this on, they start watching it, and as soon as you open the idea that maybe their path isn't the only path, how many people might it would be interesting to see, the stop point, and then also how many people maybe chose the path and go, I'm going to be open today, and maybe take in a different idea. It'd be an interesting study.
Yeah, it would. Taking a look at the studies of, because I think that the argument that we come back to so often is, let's take a moment of silence and let's have a moment of prayer for these violent acts that kind of occur. Honestly, that is a completely other topic. That's a completely different conversation for another day.
Absolutely.
What we're saying is that for the individual who's holding the consciousness, when we look at science, the science of epigenetics basically says that the environment of the organism is the greatest contributing factor to how the genes express themselves. And what that means is how the proteins are created. And when we look at proteins in a human body, and I always forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 125,000 proteins in a human body. But we have the capacity of making up to 2 million different varieties of that 125,000 that we may create.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the ability to make super proteins in the body that can heal very, very quickly, or they can also corrupt and make us susceptible to things like cancer and things along those lines. So the psychology of the individual is a really important thing, because within that science of epigenetics, we've also learned that the consciousness of the organism is the greatest contributing factor of the environment that is contributing to how the genes are expressing themselves. So the consciousness, how it interprets its reality, is really, really important. There are some metaphors that we can use as examples here that are really helpful in explaining, I think metaphors are really, they give you this thing that you can look at where you can identify with either the hero or the victim or with the example in a way that has some space away from you. And you can look at it and see, hey, there's a mechanism, there's something going on here. And then take that ideology or that archetype or whatever it is and just apply it into your own situation and ask, is this true for me? And how could this be true for me? And how could I apply this rule? So one example is the Petri dish. And with the Petri dish example, we've got 3 different Petri dishes, scientific Petri dishes. We've got a Petri dish that has toxins in it. We have a Petri dish that has nutrients in it. And then we have this third one that I like to call elevator music, because it's not going to kill you. It's not going to hurt you either way. And if we take a human cell and we put it in the Petri dish that has toxins, what do we know is going to happen to that? How is that human cell going to react to those toxins?
It's going to defend.
It's going to defend itself, exactly. So it's going to close up to defend itself. And if it doesn't eventually get nutrients, what's going to happen to that human cell?
It does.
It dies, because it can't get any nutrients, because it's protecting itself so much that it can't absorb anything. So if we take the same cell and we put it in the Petri dish that has nutrients, right? What is it going to do? If it's interpreting its environment as nutritious for it and good for it,
Absorb.
it's going to open up, it's going to absorb, it's going to grow. So we're either growing or we're dying, right? But the reality is that most of the world is more like that elevator, where the consciousness of the organism is the one that's interpreting what the environment is like. And so the consciousness is basically perceiving whether it has the ability to absorb nutrients from this environment or whether it should shut down. And so when we look at psychological patterns of trauma, when people have parts of their autonomic neural system that's shutting down to where they're defending, they have protection, defense mechanisms that are engaged, they feel a certain density. There's not a free flow. There's not a, oh, I'm relaxed. It's no, they're holding, when they have reactions, they're holding something that's really tight, and they shut down. So there's not a free flow of information, right? And so what a person believes, there's a mechanism to that. If you believe that you're safe, then it allows you to down-regulate or to finish certain trauma cycles and relax into your environment. If you're triggered in some way, it means that you have a defensive mechanism that's coming, up in order to protect you. The problem with human beings is that we have a trigger that maybe got created through modeling or through an actual trauma, mental, emotional, or physical in childhood, and we never resolved it. We never processed it. And so that upregulation, that dysregulation is still present, and that felt sense in the body of that angst is kind of a symptom that that's still there, and we haven't down-regulated back into kind of a state of flow.
So it can happen because of personal trauma, but you said modeling, and that would be watching like a parent or somebody in your life, react to trauma in their life. So even if it didn't happen directly to you, it can still affect you.
Yeah, great question. And there's two scenarios I like to use to example that. One is we now know that children of Holocaust survivors are prone to PTSD and anxiety, not because they went through the same traumas. Obviously, they weren't in the concentration camps, but because they were modeled the triggers. And when we begin examining human development, right, there's key moments in life when we're absorbing very specific patterns, right? Between the ages of in utero, in the womb, and 2, we're in a pretty constant, one of the highest aspects of brain activity there is delta. So that's like, for you and I, that's like being, completely asleep, deep sleep. Between the ages of 2 and 7, we're in this brain activity of theta. It's a dominant brain activity. So for you and I, that's kind of like, that time between being half awake, half asleep, that dream time. Like, this is why that time period for kids is such a magical time. And, it's half real and it's half fantasy. It's fairy tales, it's Santa Claus, it's Easter Bunny, right? It's also a time period where a child can absorb about 4 or 5 languages, during a very short period of time, because they're just around it, they're absorbing it, right? So the pattern in trauma for human beings is that if you look at what a child is exposed to, either what they experience or what is modeled to them during that time period, and you look at what people struggle with in their adult life later, you will see some really, really amazing correlations of data. Now, correlation is not causation, but it makes that time period in life a really, really fruitful area for mindful inquiry to see what was, dysregulated at that time period. What was, and it's not always a trauma story. Sometimes it's just the way that the individual child perceives their reality. So it's not necessarily the same for everybody, because the human abstract mind is amazing. Like it's multi-tiered, multi-layered, So we're in this brain activity here, and then we're more moving towards, alpha beta, in our adult life, and we're still holding on to these patterns that we, created when we were a child that didn't have the same type of, we just didn't have the same type of awareness, and if we haven't processed that, then that's a pretty primal type of processing that needs to happen for an adult in order to kind of reset that, that system and down-regulate it back into a state of flow. And we define flow as a state of being where it takes minimal effort for us to be us. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, absolutely. That creates a whole nother dimensionality too when you're looking back at potential places or of cause. You're at a state now where a lot of times, like for me personally, I walked into a season of life where I knew I needed growth, or I wanted growth. There was a lot of angst and overwhelm, didn't know where it was coming from. And so then as you start looking, you're looking first and foremost, well, what happened to me? What was my experience? Where were my traumas? But then when you add the whole level of, well, this could have came from modeling or generational things that you were exposed to at a young age, what's a whole nother area that you have to really sift through to potentially find those.
Yeah, I mean, we're especially, I mean, post 9/11, post, war on terror. I mean, we're living in a trauma world, now, and I mean, what that means is that there's a lot of people that have not been taught the skills that science has actually discovered on how to reset our systems. And when we talk about the mechanism of belief, what you believe about how you're safe, what you believe about where you're at, what you believe about your relationship with God is a really great example. Because as an example, if you believe there is no God, and I'm not here to tell people what to believe. All I'm talking about is a mechanism that's kind of there. If you believe there is no, for example, you're atheist, and there may be some atheists that would argue with me on the definition of this, and that's fine. There may be variations of this, but as a generality, what I will throw out there is that I don't know if I've really met an atheist. Most of the atheists that I've talked to, it's not that they don't believe in God, it's that they're kind of mad at God. But when we go with more of a definition of agnostic, like I don't know, right? Okay, well, that's a little bit more open. Well, are you open to that? What I'm saying is that there's a scripture that I really love to throw out there, not because we're talking about religion or we're telling people what to believe. It says, unless you come as a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think this is a beautiful metaphor. And the reason is because as a human being, we have these amazing advanced abstract reasoning machines. We have this prefrontal cortex. My dog does not have a forehead, right? He's got a memory of 18 to 20 seconds, approximately. He does not have abstract reasoning. So we have the ability to be in any moment in a fantasy abstract version of our past, version of our future, or even an abstract version of now, and none of what we're even imagining has to be real. Now, the beauty of that is that abstract reasoning allows us to dream of mechanisms and ways that we can control our environment. That's why we're the masters, so to speak, of Earth. Is there a better way? That's what that allows us to do. But at the same time, it can also be a trap for us where we stay in an abstract reality. We stay in the story of our lives instead of actually in our lives. And so what we believe about what is true, like when we talk about cognitive therapy, I mean, the root aspect of cognitive therapy is asking the question of the thought that's creating the feeling, is this true? Right? That is the root of cognitive behavioral therapy. Is this true? Powerful, powerful question. Because what you believe will be true for you. You will flavor your world with your perception. Perception is everything. So belief is a very, very powerful mechanism, not just from a spiritual standpoint, but what you believe about yourself, what you believe about your world, and how that kind of shows up for you. So there is a mechanism. I would encourage people to have a relationship with the divine. I'm not here to tell people what that relationship should be, but I will say that if you can't play with this imagination, come as a child, then you can't activate the placebo effect of having a connection with the divine, right? If it's possible to receive something from the divine, and what I am suggesting is that there is a mechanism of imagination that physically shifts the way that we perceive our reality. Whether or not the divine is true is not as important as the fact that we're using our imagination to connect to something, to receive something. Meaning, I mean, that suggests that energy is always available. And if everything is energy, that's always actually true. All we're saying is that you're using your consciousness in a very specific way to access that energy. It doesn't, who do you want to talk to? You want to talk to Buddha, Jesus, the white buffalo? To me, it doesn't really truly matter as long as that we ask some more important questions like, does it work? Now, some people might get offended because they're so attached to their particular way, and they feel that they're on this mission to, make sure everybody else has that way. And that's very common. I mean, it's very common that the way that most people feel that they've been saved in other words, felt a freedom in their heart and their chest, frequently is the way that they want to then share and teach with others. I mean, it's we are empathetic creatures. Like I found this thing here. I want it. Why? Because we're also social creatures. We want value and worth based off of what we can share, with each other. That's a part of how we're built. As a part of our survival mechanism. It's very social creatures. It's a very important part. The two biggest predictors of happiness: gratitude, social connection.
That's huge right there.
Yeah. So if you can have a conversation with the divine, and I'm only using the divine because it's such a simple example. There's a lot of different examples of how we work with belief about, are we worthy? Oh my God, that's probably in the U.S. especially, where we have a culture that's so independent. Like we value this, independent nature, but the contrast of that is that we kind of say no to groupism in a lot of different ways, and the group takes care of the individuals, right? And the studies on happiness and the positive psychology they've blown up a lot of belief things. Like we used to think I think a lot of people thought that, everybody makes it on their own. And the science says that's not actually true. Like it's impossible for us. Like we're inherently either we're helping others or we're using other people in some way to raise ourselves. Even if it's the most, what we would say the most successful billionaire, they still built that on the backs of society, in some way. We can't do this without other people. And why should we? So this aspect of am I enough? Just the belief of that, it'd be better for people just to go ahead and go, you know what, I'm not enough. And just kind of bottom out with that, be with that for a moment and accept that and okay, and neither is anyone else, but together we can be, together we can be. There is a mechanism of belief that if you believe in things a certain way, you get energy in certain ways also. And honestly, this is an expansive topic. We could probably keep going in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, early on you'd mentioned that it can either be something that helps you or doesn't. And I think what you're saying by that was it helps you or it can actually hinder or fight against progress or against flow. It's a paradoxical world. Something that jumped to mind was if I'm in a place of angst and I find a religious path, say insert Christianity, I come through this particular path and it's Jesus. All of a sudden there's a release, there's more flow, there's community that happens, other people that believe similarly, things like that. But then I attach that great feeling, all the positive things that happen, I attach that to that one particular belief system. So now when I go to other people that I see in trouble or in any form of angst, or in a similar position that I once was, I have that empathy. So now I want to give them that freedom and that release that I experienced, but I do that only through my way, which was Jesus. And if it's a different way, I can almost attack it or feel attacked by it.
Because it would take away your identity.
Exactly.
And to lose your own identity is a trauma.
And so then I'm attaching belief into one certain thing, even though maybe it's a little broader than that. That path worked for me, but someone else that I care about could also receive the similar result. Maybe in a similar fashion, but with a different idea or belief itself.
Yeah, we talked earlier about these different metaphoric ways of receiving energy. Bio, emotional, lower mental, upper mental, soul, spirit. There's this other aspect when it comes to belief where what we see in a lot of fundamental religions, and so we see this both in some of extremism in Islam, we see it in extremism in Christianity, is that there's almost a new trauma term that's known as trauma syndrome, religious trauma syndrome. And in religious trauma syndrome, what we're seeing is that there's such a spiritual bypass where only this particular perception of God is where the information comes, that people are splitting their consciousness and not accessing these other avenues of how we get energy. So like bio. So, if you're convinced that there's a story of black and white, and this is what we often see, black and white, in places where people, there's so many different things that people busting out of kind of cultish kind of scenarios, where they like it was either this or this. It was, my way or the highway, kind of thing. and frequently there was such control there wasn't even a highway option, as well. But just these ultimatums, these it's black or white. What's another term for that? It's just there's this all or nothing kind of thing. So people stop trusting their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So their body may be giving them intuition that this doesn't feel right, but this story is bulldozing over these other areas where we get energy. So people begin not trusting themselves. And so, and you'll see this a lot. A simple example that's not religious would be if a child that's artistic that is born into a scientific family. So in this example, we can easily see how there's just no way that artsy child is going to be necessarily appreciated by the really sciencey family, right? So those group norms are one of the most controlling, powerful things in the world. They truly are. When we have people modeling things and saying this is okay, you see this shift in society. And we've seen this in, the political, arena in the last, 5 to 10 years also, to where there's an extremism that shows up. But when people shut down, and like in that example of the art versus science, there's that part of the child that's basically split off from their consciousness now being bulldozed over. Well, it's still there, but it's not being allowed to come to the surface, right? And to my eyes, like this type of split consciousness, using this example, this metaphor, is like the biggest disease of the planet right now, to where we have all these parts of ourselves that are going in different direction because of what society expects or our family unit expects, or these expectations that we can't live up to because our soul, that part of us that's truly authentic, really wants something else. So we're literally moving in different directions and having a battle, an eternal war inside of ourselves. Now there's this metaphoric aspect that it's really easy to manifest or create what you want as long as you get all 14 rowers in your rowboat rowing in the same direction. Well, in the example we just gave you, there's at least one part that's not, this part that really wants to be an artist. And so this child goes and, maybe they have a successful career, maybe they don't in science, but they've buried this truly amazing part of them, as well. There's another story example I heard once. It was talking about this child that was just going to be the world's greatest opera singer, and at the age of 8, they started singing, and the parent that they had was having a bad day, and like, oh my God, shut up, you sound horrible. And I shut down the child. And it never was what it could be, as well. Like, this is the tragedy of split consciousness. So a part of our job is to not just understand that there's a mechanism of belief, but to understand that we often have parts that are believing actually different things. And a part of the trauma work that we need to do is to be able to give voice to those different parts of us and to allow them to truly speak in such a way that we negotiate between the parts. Because often what's happening is that there's a part of us that's shut down as a method of protecting, or there's a part of us that's shut down because another part of us bulldozed over. And so, like, there's a way for us to talk to those things, and most of us haven't been doing it nicely.
So when you're saying parts, you're meaning parts within yourself, different elements of your own consciousness or soul, or can you break that down a little bit?
Well, I would ask anybody that's listening at the moment, is there something within you that you've always felt that you were meant to do? And I haven't met a person yet that doesn't feel that way, all right? Okay, so let's use that as an example. Let's say that society, parents, money, whatever fear that was instilled in you that gave you a belief that this wasn't possible kind of bulldozed over that. Well, what if we made room for that to come to the surface and we nurtured it from the other parts, and we said, no, I want to hear what you have to create. I want to hear what you have to say. And if you had that kind of loving, supporting environment, what could that part of you actually create? And I think that a lot of us look external and we're like, well, if I just had the right wife or the right husband or the right, if I didn't have these kids, right? This what if, but it's a micro macro world. What that means is that there's 2 ways to change the world, right? One is with sledgehammers. I've never been successful at that, right? The other one is to shift the way that we're holding the world, right? And we've seen this in so many different examples with mindfulness, with with positive psychology, that when we're able to shift the way that we're holding the world, it's amazing how much, like when we're able to create space within ourselves where we're not reacting in the same way, it's amazing how much that creates space around us and frequently creates space for other people. Instead of us going out there and demanding space, for other people. Like there's a different way for us to shift the energy of how we're perceiving the world. And the amazing part of that is that belief of us having a mastery inside of ourselves always equates to us beginning to have a mastery outside of ourselves. We will see things change right before our very eyes. With the world that we live in becomes just a much more enjoyable place. But if you're, at this moment, you're one of those people that's convinced that the world is a horrible place, well, we don't see the world the way it is. We see the world the way we are. Boy, if there's ever a more powerful statement to taking responsibility for what we're projecting the world to be. Well, what if the world is the way it is because of the way it is inside of us? Well, then what's your responsibility as a human being? That's a powerful understanding. Well, what are you doing to do that? And what we hear is people are so busy doing that they haven't learned how to be. And if they could take time to learn how to be, they could really stop all the doing, because a lot of things take care of themselves after you learn how to be. And people that are listening to this are going, yeah, well, I don't know what your life is like, but no, I am a householder. I got 2 kids, I am an older father, it is like there is daddy taxi, there is this, there is bills to pay, there's things that are moving on, somebody's got to get up in the middle of the night when the dog wants to go out. Like there are things that are happening, right? And there's daily tasks that have to be done, and there's always something that, that's what life is, it's moving. But how we hold that life, is a really, really important question. This is why we want to point to things like, the Practicing Presence program that's, we'll be putting out, and, to processing our generational childhood and past relationship trauma, so that we're playing a game of Risk. We're literally, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually reclaiming defense mechanism energy inside of ourselves, so that we can down-regulate it and use that energy to create the life that we want. Mm-hmm. And if we've got all of these things that are keeping us in density, in reaction, well, there's no energy to create. So, it would be more powerful for us to just be still and empty than it would for us to be doing all this busy activity where we're everywhere and we're reacting and we're resenting and we're lost in the story of victimhood about how we're at the fate of whatever, it may be. So belief of how we hold the world, belief in ourselves, belief, all of these. And what we are suggesting is there are systematic ways for us to use mindful inquiry and processing to go inside ourselves. Gnostic, gnosis, inner knowing, to go inside ourselves and to begin taking control of our own strings of the puppet and not allow the conditioning of the world to dictate how we show up in the world. Most people have neural cow paths. Neural cow path. I'll give you an example. There's 2 studies at the University of Kansas where we show that if somebody's gone through a major depressive episode, then 2 or 3, I forget how many, but at some point, after we've done this a couple times, there is a physical neural pathway that is created in the brain that any stimulus, sorry, my phone's going off, any stimulus that has been associated with that, a song, a smell of coffee, whatever it may be, we no longer need to have the origin of that depression. We just need the stimulus to go down that cow path. So let's back up just a moment. Let's really look at kind of a root, simple explanation of what depression is, right? At its root, depression is, here's the reality I'm in, here's the reality I want to be in, and they're not the same. That is the root cause of depression. I don't know if you can get more simple than that. And then, so you go through something like that, and everybody does, at some point, and there's another stimulus that's, added to that. Smell of baked bread. I'm just throwing stuff out there, right? And then you go down, 2-3 weeks, and suddenly there's a song or a smell of baked bread or whatever, and boom, that cow path is already there. The beauty of that is what we've learned in neuroscience of the brain is that we have a neuroplasticity. So even though we can create neural cow paths to sadness, we also have the ability to create neural paths to happiness as well. So there are things that people can do that we now have science, like, doing a gratitude journal for a certain number of days. We now know, like 6 months later, like we can measure people's happiness. Like we can look at that and say, hey, this is where it was and this is where it is, with key measurement factors as well. That's incredible to me. So it's more powerful to learn how to be silent than it is to try to keep doing but reacting in ways that we're vibrating an energy that's just not, where we want to be in the world. In the science of happiness now, there was one meta-study that was taken like over 200 studies showing that success does not equate to happiness. In fact, it's the exact opposite. When you really track the data, happiness predicts success every single time. So what we're saying then is that it's more important for you to farm your happiness than it is for you to go create that business first. Right? Like that's what it's saying. That's what the science is saying.
That's really interesting.
I mean, because when you're in a place of happiness, like there's such an advantage to that in workplaces, and there's all these really interesting things that they do, like creating coffee stations so there's social connection, with people. And when you come from a controlled management scenario, why are y'all wasting time, kind of thing, to realize that to let people screw around on social media and to let people have a coffee station where they connect, and to have social aspects actually increases your productivity. I mean, the science is really clear on this stuff. What you believe about different things. What people think works is not what really works, and that's what we want to do. Is we want to be able to look at things and say what works, what doesn't work, what's next, as well. So, belief. Like, what beliefs hold you down, or what beliefs lifts you up? Would be a good example for us to throw out there.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I guess my family. That's a huge one that lifts me up, drives me forward. But almost everything, there's a duality, and that's something that I keep mentally going back as I listen. There's always this tension that we have, whether it's belief in God, and it can drive you forward, or it can be the thing that tears you away from a group of people. I can go into a group and go, well, 90% of the people in this coffee shop believe something contrary to what I believe. So they're bad people, or I'm uncomfortable here, or I can't connect because they don't believe what I believe. It can rip you away. Or the same, my family is everything, and what happens when your kids go to college and you're an empty nester now, and all of a sudden, what do you do now? Is your family different than what your perception of what family looks like or is supposed to look like? Do you go into depression because you don't have that idea of family anymore that you had just wrapped your identity around? There's the duality there just keeps jumping out to me for whatever reason today.
I really like your example of like moving through the seasons of life. It's kind of what you stated there. There's a couple different metaphors. One is the rosebud stayed a bud until the pain of not blooming became too great. Like the one thing that we can, if you look at this world, you look down on the subatomic level, there's not one single part of this reality that isn't consumed at some point by another part of it. There's nothing that's not changing. So change is an absolute constant. And I think that you really identified one of the things that people struggle with the most, which is a shift, a change, or a loss of identity, or a fear of losing that identity. And letting go when we have to grow is a really, really important aspect. And what I would say to people that are struggling with life changes is there are ways to do mindful inquiry and to keep watching and look at some of the courseworks that we throw out there or that we point to. There are ways that you can move through things with the way that you ask very specific questions of parts of yourself. And sometimes I think that it's kind of like in a relationship, the Gottman material we look at, and we know that when we really do need to address something, that we need to be as specific as possible. Because if we're vague, when we're talking about our partners, like when we have a vague complaint, like vague is a character assassination that there's no defense against. So we really want to be able to get specific, and often as we ask specific question of, okay, what is working? What is not working? What is that? How am I suffering? What a great question. How am I suffering? And can I be with that long enough, really be with it. And what I mean by be with it is not hold it out here and like be trying to push it away or like be dreading it. But like imagine opening your chest and like allow that pain, because pain is a guide. Pain is always a guide. There's no scenario where pain is not a guide. It's always going, hey, pay attention to this. This needs attention, right? That's what pain is always saying. And so if we listen to the wisdom of that guide, and then we fully embrace, and when we're moving through things, and we'll talk about this in some of the coursework also, but there's awareness, there's acknowledgement, there's acceptance. Those are 3 very different levels of consciousness, right? With acceptance being really kind of the hard one, going, this is what it is. In trauma work, you can't move away from a place that you don't admit exists. And so if we're holding on to reality that's changing whether we want it to or not, and we haven't let go of what isn't true anymore, well, you can't live, like you have to move with the world. Like you have to, even though we may be living in this energetic world where we can create things, like you have to have a foot in both places. It's like you have to be able to adapt. Jon Kabat-Zinn has this wonderful quote that I'm sure a lot of people have heard. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn how to surf. And that's what we want to be able to teach people is there is a way to hold your reality and there's a way to digest it. Meaning that if you're really struggling and overwhelmed, well, one word that I like to use whenever somebody says that they're overwhelmed is focus. And so don't try to swallow the whole elephant at once. Life coaching is about, taking your reality and dividing it up into compartments. So maybe it's our spirituality, maybe there's our diet, there's our exercise, there's our romantic relationship, there's a relationship with our children, our parents, our friends, our work, our career, our education. All of these are different areas, right? Mm-hmm. Like, don't try to swallow all of that at once. I gotta make all these changes. I'm gonna quit smoking and start running at the same. It's difficult, right? One at a time. Return one ball at a time, and take an inventory of where you're at, and really move through. I'm aware, acknowledge, and accept where I'm at. Take an inventory of where you truly want to be. Truly. And there's ways to ask questions about that in order to get, I don't even know what I want to do. Believe me, move through some of the coaching material. There are ways that we can get you really clear on how to ask questions of yourself in order to get power and velocity moving in certain directions. But take one at a time. We do a subtraction on the difference between the ideal and where we're at, and we start working on that differential. And it's not as hard when you take small bites and you start getting, you really start looking at how you're getting your needs filled and what it is that you truly want. There is a way to prune. And in gardening, what we do is there's a thing called deadheading. We deadhead roses that have already bloomed and they're starting to go to seed. And the reason is because we don't necessarily want them to go to seed. Now, if we wanted the seeds to go plant, that would be a different thing. But in this scenario, we want something to bloom in our life. And so we don't want the energy going to making seed. We want to cut that, deadhead that off, knock that off, and we want the energy going where we want it to. It's the same thing in how we're organizing our life as well. What are the areas that you're not putting the energy that you know that you need? And then grabbing some clarity of how you commit to that, specifically. And so belief, one of the biggest challenges I think in belief is people stay vague.
You can see that.
They stay vague. Or they don't really know what they believe, and so they then go with the flow. And even if the flow isn't authentic and it isn't real, or it doesn't align with what your soul truly believes, or your heart's desire, like who you really truly are, your own voice. And I think that is one of the biggest epidemics also here in the States, is that we have a lot of people that haven't found their voice, and we would want to teach them. There's so many amazing somatic techniques now, EMDR, EFT, breathworks, SRI, that, focusing. And that's not even a drop in the ocean of what is actually vagal toning, where we can begin communicating with the body in a way that allows it to release what we've been holding in the mind. And when we do that, what was trauma becomes just a story, And so, belief is belief on a cognitive level, on an emotional level, on a physical felt sense level. It's all. And there's a lot of people that are struggling because they're only dealing in the cognitive realm, and they're trying to think their way through without being in touch with the other ways that they can perceive reality. Being in touch with their body is a really common thing that's not happening.
Or you can do the opposite, where all you do is feel, but it's just this vague feeling. You have some form of belief, but you don't stop to really articulate it and put words to what is it that I believe and what am I feeling based off of that.
So that's really a whole other program. We start talking about the felt sense as well. But I mean, just very quickly as an example, we talked about the one reason for depression. Well, there's generally two reasons for anxiety. Yes, I know the DSM will give you all of these different disorders, right? Okay, great. They'll give you all these lists of symptoms is what they'll give them. But there's two major categories of anxiety. One is you're in danger. That's a good signal, The other is something has occurred to you as a human being that has dysregulated your autonomic nervous system. It has come out of flow up into dysregulation, and it hasn't had resolution, hasn't completed that cycle yet. Anxiety is the symptom that exists. And if you listen to how the anxiety is being held in the body, it will tell you kind of how to go about healing. So there's a question that we ask people when they have anxiety. One of the questions I would ask would be, where? Where in your body do you have anxiety? And you can very quickly see whether or not somebody is thinking their way through life because they'll be lost in the story and they'll want to tell you all about the story, or they want to be telling you all about the emotion. Well, what we're asking is not about the story and not about the emotion. I want to know the felt sense. Is it in the head or in the neck? Is it in the neck or in the chest? Is it in the chest or in the stomach? Do you feel it more in the peripherals? Like there's patterns to how things show up in the body also. So if you're lost in the story, and the neurology, science, the things that we've discovered, like when people are lost in a story, there's a type of brain activity that's lighting up inside the brain that that's called the default mode network. Now the default mode network is great. Again, it's abstract thinking. It allows you to do a lot of things, but it's also a narrative. And if you're suffering, guess what? You're in a narrative, but only always, because there's what is, and there's our story about what is. Well, what is always neutral, always. I mean, we could spend an entire hour with people throwing things up on a board and me throwing it back and going, here's why this is what is. No matter how horrible the story is, because there's either what is and the story what is. What is always neutral. The story about what is, never neutral. Okay, so what do we need to learn how to do? Come out of the story and deal with what is. And there's so much energy that's going into the story that it sometimes becomes very, very difficult for people because of what they believe. In religious trauma syndrome, when you disassociate, and there's a lot of scenarios that I've seen in this, where you no longer believe your own body. Mm-hmm. Okay, well now we ask you the question, where are you holding anxiety? And you may not feel anything, below the neck. What's really interesting is you ask somebody, no, they say, well, I feel it in my head. I'm like, okay, is that the abstract concept of the mind? Or do you have a physical sensation like heaviness, tightness, burning, something like that in the head? And if they're not used to being in touch with their body, you'll literally see them they'll be a little dizzy across their eye because they're literally rewiring at that moment to pay attention to the perception that you just offered them that they never pay attention to. This is why in mindfulness, one of the very first meditations we take people through is the body scan. We're having a date with ourselves, moving through the body. What is that doing? We're increasing neuropeptide flow of communication between the brain and the body so that we're receiving more information from the sensors of our body. Why? Because that's where we're holding the charge. The body is keeping score. And the more information that we receive, energy and information, remember, they're the same thing. The more energy we receive, the more information we receive. The more information we receive, the more energy. The more energy we have, the more the body will naturally, organically move into healing all by itself. And I think that we need to have probably another one of these where we're talking a lot more about trauma and the leopard and the impala, things like that, as well, that we'll get into in another scenario. This one was really meant to be about mechanisms of belief, but you see how you can rabbit trail and everything connects to everything. I mean, it can always do this. In almost any talk about anything, it can head in a lot of different directions at the same time.
That's why I wanted to get onto belief, because it's so foundational.
Yeah.
You know, really what you believe and being able to not be
Perception.
vague. It just, you can, you know, anything you extrapolate on, it always kind of comes back to, well, what do you believe?
You know, there's an art teacher that I had that said, you know, learning how to paint, learning how to draw really wasn't about learning how to paint or draw. It was about learning how to see. Because if you can see it, you can create it. And I thought that was just so poetic and so meaningful. Because in trauma work, when we talk about belief, well, what do most people believe? Well, they believe what they see. And even then, when they see it, sometimes it's hard. But let's just go with see for a minute. And I like to use this example where we talk about the difference between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, right? So let's say that I'm an individual that is, you know, it's all or nothing, black and white. It has to be black or white. It's either all evil or it's all good, you know? And most of the world is gray, honestly. But that's the way that I believe. Well, I'm only seeing the world from these 2 perceptions. So think of a flat piece of paper, 2-dimensional, right? And I'm just stuck because I don't have any choices at all. This just is the way that it is, and I'm in suffering because I can't figure out a way out of this place of the state of being, of suffering. So the moment that we bring perception out of, for example, thought and into the body, we've just added a 3rd perception, a new way of physically experiencing our reality. And so we've just moved from 2D, we've added another point in space, we've just created 3D. The moment that we've done that, where we were stuck, well now, you know, look, there's space right there, right? We now have a way to flow through that was always there. We just couldn't feel it. We couldn't see it previously. So now that we can feel it, well, now energy can move. And when the energy moves, well, now we can downregulate and we can not be holding things. So what this points to is that if you play with your perception and mindful inquiry and processing in very specific ways, you can shift the way that you feel and how you're holding reality very, very quickly. It's why I really love to do, you know, EFT tapping with, because, you know, 85% of people do respond to that, because it allows, and I'll do a simple exercise with people that allows them to feel something different in a first session. And I think it's really, really important, because the moment somebody experiences something new, well, that's no longer a philosophical understanding. That's an experiential understanding. I felt that. I now have an inner knowing because I experienced something. Ooh, that's different. I feel different. What did you just do, Scott? You know, like, okay, well now I'm what? I'm curious. And curiosity is the superpower in healing and creating the life that you want. Because curiosity means you're going to keep asking those questions until you find the answer. You know, and not to harp on Christianity, but man, there's so many little gems. You know, ask and you shall receive. I think that the part of that is be curious. You know, like keep asking until you understand. There is so many ways to look at something, and if you're only looking at them from these 2, chances are, you know, there's another example in Rome, in what is it, St. Peter's, in the square that's there. They have these big giant columns, right? And if you're standing in one particular place, then you only see the one column. But the reality is there's columns behind the columns. And so if you just move to the left or right a little bit, one way or the other, suddenly you see that there's a bunch of other columns that are there. I mean, it's just such a beautiful artistic, you know, representation that life is not really what most people think or see it is. That there's a lot of other flavors, a lot of other degrees, and a lot of other ways to perceive life. And that's the way that we create movement in our life, is tasting different perceptions. You know, I don't think there's anything more important than, if we have the availability to do so, than to share travel with our children, to share exposure to other cultures, other ways of doing things, just a different flavor of mass consciousness in the air, you know, people's culture. So like to be able to experience that there's something that's different, and life may not be this set way that I've only experienced, you know. It's powerful to change your belief structure that way.
Absolutely.
Did we cover enough on belief today?
I think so.
Okay. Well, that was our session on mechanisms of belief. Scott Martin with Jake Cardwell, and we'll see you on another session. Take care, guys.